The champagne sparkled in the glasses like tiny imprisoned suns, and Mary Fontaine had no time to admire any of it. She crossed the Grand Imperial Hotel ballroom with a tray of canapés in her right hand, and her mind fixed on her daughter, whom she had left in the care of her neighbor, Mrs. C, a 70-year-old woman who slept more than she was awake. It was almost 11 at night, and Sophie, her 8-year-old daughter, needed someone truly present. Mary skirted a group of women with enormous jewelry and rehearsed smiles, dodged a waiter who almost dropped a bottle of imported wine, and stopped before a table where two men discussed business with the intensity of those who believe the world revolves around their decisions. She offered the canapés with a professional smile, received a dismissive nod and moved on. It had been 4 months since Mary had traded her white lab coat for the hotel's grey uniform. 4 months since her life had collapsed with the precision of an imploded building, calculated, deliberate, leaving no salvageable debris. Professor Robert Caldwell, her advisor for almost a decade, had published an article in the country's largest scientific journal, signed only by him. The article contained 3 years of her work: the molecules, the compounds, the formulas, the sleepless nights, the hopes, anti-cancer compounds, the research she silently called the work of my life. When she confronted him, he laughed. Then, he used all his influence to ensure that no laboratory, no university, no research institute in the UK would want to hear the name Mary Fontaine. The letter he circulated among his contacts claimed she was unstable, dishonest, and had tried to steal credit for research that wasn't hers. The lie was crude, but it was signed by a man with 30 years of curriculum and academic awards on his wall. And so, she ended up at the Grand Imperial. That evening's gala was in honor of Ryan Sampson, CEO of the Sampson Group, an investment conglomerate ranging from hotels to pharmaceutical laboratories. 38 years old, son of a family of industrialists from the English countryside, Ryan had inherited his father's business and multiplied it tenfold with a combination of genuine talent and elegant cruelty. He was the kind of man who never shouted. He preferred to destroy in a low voice, with a smile on his lips and a glass of wine in his hand. Mary saw him for the first time as she passed with her tray near the central stage. He was laughing at something his assistant had said, and there was something in the laugh too wide, too calculated, that bothered her without her being able to explain why. Beside him, a woman in a red dress, Isabella Drummond, his girlfriend, smiled with her mouth and watched with her eyes. It was the kind of attention that wasn't affectionate. It was then that the accident happened. Mary didn't see the step. Or rather, she saw it too late. The tray slipped from her hand just as she stumbled, and the sound of canapés scattering across the white marble was loud enough to turn a few heads. She fell to her knees, her uniform crumpled, her knee aching, and began to pick up the appetizers with her hands, with the desperate speed of someone who knows that mistakes have consequences. The voice came from above. "Look what we have here." It was Ryan. He had approached without her noticing, followed by a small group of curious guests. He looked at her with that expression some wealthy people develop, a mixture of amusement and disdain, as if others' misfortunes were a spectacle created for their pleasure. "A maid with the grace of an elephant in a china shop," he said, and some laughter spread through the group. Mary stood up. She was 34 years old, had an unfinished doctorate, and a daughter waiting at home. She had no room for humiliation, but she also had no room to react because she needed this job. "I apologize, sir," she said, her voice controlled. Ryan studied her with curiosity. There was something about her that didn't fit the scene, a posture, a look, something he couldn't name but that subtly bothered him. "You have an interesting face," he said as if it were an insult. "Too bad the uniform doesn't match." It was Isabella who had the idea. She approached with the slight smile of someone who had just thought of a fun game and pointed to the side display case in the ballroom, where a haute couture dress was exhibited. It was a creation by the London designer Beatrice Vancroft, entirely in champagne silk with hand embroidery, part of a collection that would be auctioned later that night. The estimated value, printed on a small plaque next to it, $2 million. "Ryan, darling," Isabella said in a sweet voice, "how about a fun bet? If this girl can wear that dress and look truly elegant, you marry her." Laughter. Lots of laughter. Someone raised their phone to film. Mary felt the heat rise to her face. She felt anger, compact and hot like embers. She looked at Isabella, who laughed with eyes gleaming with cruelty. She looked at Ryan, who shook his head with a smile that found the idea absurd but entertaining. "Why not?" he said, shrugging. "If a maid can make that £2 million dress look like it was made for her, I swear I'll marry her." More laughter. More phones raised. Mary thought of Sophie. She thought of her daughter's face that morning, asking why Mummy had to work in the early hours. She thought of the 3 years of stolen research, Robert Caldwell's letter, the silent laboratories that didn't return her emails. She thought of all the times she had swallowed her anger, because she had no choice. She looked directly at Ryan Sampson. "I accept," she said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the buzz resumed, excited, anticipating the ridicule. Isabella was already laughing before Mary even entered the makeshift changing room behind the stage. The collection manager, a thin assistant with a panicked look, tried to intervene, but Ryan silenced her with a gesture. Mary entered the changing room alone. She closed the curtain. She stood still for a moment, looking at the dress hanging on the rack, illuminated by a faint light. It was of a disturbing beauty. She ran her fingers over the silk and took a deep breath. She hadn't chosen that moment, but she had arrived there carrying everything she was, and everything she was, she would soon discover, was more than any ballroom had ever seen. When she emerged from the changing room, the ballroom fell silent. The dress fit as if it had been tailored for her body. The champagne silk caught the light in a way that seemed intentional, and Mary walked with the posture of someone who had never in her life needed to apologize for existing. It wasn't vanity. It was something older and more solid than that. She stopped in front of Ryan Sampson, who for the first time that night didn't have a ready smile. "Well," she said, her voice low enough for only him to hear the first part, "it seems you have a promise to keep." Ryan opened his mouth, closed it. The phones were still recording. "But don't worry," Mary continued, now in a clear voice for the entire ballroom, "because I wouldn't marry you even if you were the last man available on this planet. I accepted this bet to prove a simple thing. People are not entertainment, and no amount of money changes that." The silence that followed this time was different. It was the silence of those who don't know whether to applaud or disappear. Isabella was the first to react. She pointed her index finger at Mary and said loudly, "She's stealing the dress, someone call security." And it was at that moment that everything began to unravel in a way no one in that ballroom could have predicted. Security didn't need to be called. It was Gus Brennan, Ryan's partner, and one of the few present at that gala who seemed to have been born with a sense of decency, who put his own body between Mary and the 2 approaching security guards. Gus was 42, with graying temples and a habit of observing before speaking. He had watched everything that night with the discomfort of someone who recognizes an injustice but hasn't yet found the right moment to say so. "Enough," Gus said with a firmness that didn't need volume. "She's not stealing anything. The dress is intact." Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but Ryan touched her arm lightly. There was something on his face at that instant, an expression that wasn't quite shame, but a close relative of it, that made Isabella recoil. The ballroom watched. The phones were still recording. Mary returned to the changing room without haste. She took off the dress with the same care with which she had put it on, folded it over the rack, and emerged in her grey uniform again, the empty tray in her hand, as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. But they had happened, and the cell phone cameras were witnesses. She worked until the end of her shift. There were tables to clean, trays to restock, and a knee that throbbed discreetly since the fall. She didn't say another word about the incident. She just worked. The night was drawing to a close when Supervisor Claudia Roche called her to a corner of the back corridor. Claudia was 50, with dyed brown hair and a habit of smiling with her mouth, while her eyes conveyed another message. She was the kind of boss who knew exactly which side her bread was buttered on and never slipped. "You caused a serious embarrassment tonight," Claudia said, without preliminaries. "I was publicly humiliated by a guest," Mary replied. "Mr. Sampson is one of this hotel's biggest sponsors." Claudia adjusted her badge as if closing an argument. "As of tomorrow, you're transferred to the laundry room. Night shift, 3 in the morning to 11. Mary stood still. The laundry room was in the hotel basement, windowless, with the constant noise of industrial machines and humidity that clung to the skin. The night shift was the one nobody wanted, and Sophie needed someone at home during the night. "The transfer is a punishment," Mary said. "The transfer is a reallocation of resources," Claudia corrected with her usual smile. "You can sign the form now or hand in your badge." Mary signed. She took the bus back home shortly after midnight. The apartment was small, in the Brixton neighbourhood of London, on the second floor of a building without an elevator that smelled of dampness and neighbours cooking. Mrs. C was sleeping on the sofa when she arrived, the television on a talk show with the volume at minimum. Sophie was in bed, hugging the teddy bear Mary had won at a scientific conference in Cambridge years ago, when the world still seemed to make sense. Mary stood at the bedroom door looking at her daughter for a long moment. Sophie was 8 and had her mother's eyes, and already understood more about hardship than a child should ever need to understand. She never complained about the small apartment, never asked for the things her classmates had. Sometimes that hurt more than if she did ask. The next morning, the video had reached 300,000 views. Mary discovered this when she opened her phone after dropping Sophie off at school. Someone had cut the most dramatic moment of the previous night, from Mary's exit from the changing room to the confrontation with Ryan, and posted it with a caption that simply read, "When the maid left everyone speechless." In the comments, people debated, some laughing, others indignant, many asking to know who that woman was. She closed her phone and went to the hotel basement. The laundry room was exactly as she had imagined. Large, noisy, humid, lit by fluorescent lamps that hummed slightly. Industrial machines the size of small cars agitated sheets and towels in endless cycles. The smell of fabric softener was so strong that it lingered on clothes hours after leaving. It was there that she met Benita. Benita Sanders was 56, with short white hair and a way of moving between the machines that suggested decades of intimacy with that environment. She had worked at the hotel for 18 years and knew the basement like a cartographer knows their map. When Mary arrived, disoriented, looking for where to store her bag, it was Benita who found her. "First time down here?" Benita asked without drama. "Transferred last night." Benita nodded, as if receiving information she had already expected. "Sit here. I'll show you how the machines work. They have their own personalities, I swear to God." There was something about Benita that made the basement a little less heavy. She worked humming quietly to herself, told stories of famous guests she recognized by their clothes and never by their faces, and had a gift for talking about difficult things without making the person feel like they were drowning in them. That first afternoon, as they folded sheets side by side, Benita asked, "You're the one from the video, right?" Mary paused, then continued folding. "I am. Saw it this morning, my daughter sent it to me." Benita paused calculatedly. "You're beautiful and brave. Those two things together really scare the wrong people." Mary didn't reply, but for the first time in many hours, she felt something that wasn't exactly comfort, but that came close to being seen. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor of the Sampson Group at the Shard on Canary Wharf, Ryan Sampson was in an emergency meeting that hadn't been scheduled in his diary. It was 3 in the afternoon, and his communications director, Annabelle Miller, had requested an hour with him and Gus using the word urgent twice in the same email, which was never a good sign. The video had reached 1 million views before lunch. "It's going viral on all platforms," Annabelle said, her laptop open on the table. "The hashtags are all against you. Boycott Sampson Group has been trending since 10 this morning. 3 investors have already sent messages asking what happened, and an American fund with whom we were negotiating a partnership sent an email requesting clarification before signing anything." Ryan looked at the screen with an expression that wasn't regret. It was something more pragmatic, the internal calculator of a man accustomed to measuring problems in terms of cost and benefit. "Who is she?" he asked. Annabelle exchanged a quick glance with Gus before answering. "This is where it gets interesting." She turned the laptop to him. "Mary Fontaine, doctoral student in biochemistry at the University of London, researcher specializing in anti-cancer compounds. 3 years ago, her advisor, Professor Robert Caldwell, published research signed exclusively by him that her colleagues say is entirely hers. She tried to contest it, and was discredited from the entire academic community. The silence in the room was brief, but dense. "She was researching cancer treatments," Gus said slowly, "and now she's folding sheets in our hotel basement." Ryan didn't reply, but there was something on his face that wasn't there at the beginning of the meeting. "What's the plan?" he asked, returning to the pragmatic. "We have a window," Annabelle said. "If we act fast, we can turn this into a redemption story. You help her resume her career, she appears publicly by your side, the narrative shifts. The businessman who recognized his mistake and used his own resources to do good. What if she doesn't want to?" Annabelle hesitated. "We need to go to her before we find that out." Gus looked out the window at the city below. There was something in the air that afternoon that he couldn't name, the feeling that the easiest path and the right path were rarely the same, and that this time the difference would matter more than Ryan was yet able to perceive. The sun was setting over London when Mary left the laundry room, her uniform smelling of fabric softener and her shoulders aching from folding clothes for hours. She had 15 minutes to pick Sophie up from school before the neighbor needed to leave. Her phone vibrated 3 times on the way, unknown numbers that she ignored. She didn't know that the next morning 2 men in suits would descend to the basement to find her, and she didn't know what she would answer. But some part of her, that part that had survived Robert Caldwell and the letters and the silent laboratories, was already preparing. They arrived at 10 in the morning, far too well dressed for the basement. Ryan Sampson and Annabelle Miller, his communications director, descended the service stairs with the expression of those fulfilling a difficult diplomatic mission. Ryan had exchanged the previous day's black suit for a light grey blazer, a calculated attempt to appear less formal, less powerful. It didn't entirely work. Benita was the first to see them. She stopped humming and lightly touched Mary's arm, who was operating one of the larger machines. Mary looked up. It took her 2 seconds to recognize Ryan. It took her 2 more to decide she would continue working until he reached her. Ryan approached. The noise of the machines automatically made any conversation more intimate, because one had to get close to be heard. He hadn't planned this, but he noticed. "Mary Fontaine," he said. "Mr. Sampson." She didn't stop the machine. "May we talk? In private?" She turned to him with eyes that apologized for nothing. "Anything you have to say can be said here." Benita feigned absolute concentration on a pile of towels 3 meters away. Ryan breathed. Annabelle beside him opened the folder she was carrying. "We would like to propose a collaboration," Annabelle began, with the trained voice of someone who conducts such conversations professionally. "The Sampson Group is interested in funding the resumption of your research. In return, we ask for some joint public appearances to clean up Mr. Sampson's image," Mary said without inflection. A pause. "To demonstrate that the Sampson Group is committed to what exactly?" Mary finally turned off the machine. The surrounding noise continued, but it was as if a smaller, quieter space had formed between the three. To scientific research? To women who have been wronged? Or to saving a partnership with an American fund before the quarter closes? Annabelle didn't answer. Neither did Ryan. "I've been used once before," Mary said. "A man thought my work was more valuable than me. That destroyed 3 years of my life and jeopardizes research that could help people with cancer. I will not be used again. By anyone." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. There was something on his face that wasn't the calculated smile of the gala, wasn't the pragmatic businessman of the crisis meeting. It was something older, more uncomfortable, the expression of a man who is rarely refused and who doesn't quite know what to do with it. "Understood," he said finally, and he left. Annabelle lingered a second longer. "If you change your mind." She left the card on the folding counter. Mary looked at it, but didn't pick it up. Benita waited until the footsteps disappeared up the stairs before approaching. So, nothing," Mary said, restarting the machine. Benita nodded slowly, as one who respects a decision she doesn't fully understand, but understands the person who made it. The problem was that Mary's life didn't wait for her to finish processing the refusal. That same afternoon, Sophie's teacher called. The voice had that tone teachers use when they want to appear neutral but aren't. "Sophie had a problem with some classmates today. We'd like to talk to you as soon as possible." Mary went to the school the next day. in the only interval she had between the end of her shift and the start of her domestic duties. The coordinator, a woman named Felicity, received her in a small room with artificial plants and a noisy air conditioner. What had happened, as Felicity explained with surgical care, was that some of Sophie's classmates had seen the video. And because 8-year-olds don't yet have the filters that adults build with years of practice disguising cruelty, they had said things about Sophie's mother, about her uniform, about being poor, about being funny. Sophie had responded, with words first, then, when words didn't work, with shoves. "Your daughter was the physical aggressor in the situation," Felicity said carefully, "and so we need to ask that she stay home for a few days while the situation resolves itself, for reasons of coexistence in the school environment." Mary remained very quiet. "My daughter was repeatedly provoked and defended herself, and you're sending her home. Those are the school's rules of coexistence, madam." "And where are the rules of coexistence that should protect my daughter from bullying?" Felicity didn't answer directly. She said they would investigate, that it was a process, that there were protocols. Mary left the meeting with clenched teeth and a heavy heart. Sophie was waiting in the corridor, her backpack on her lap, her gaze fixed on a neutral spot on the wall. When she saw her mother, she didn't cry. That was what hurt the most, that Sophie had learned too early not to cry in places where people could see. Mary knelt in front of her daughter and hugged her. "You did right to defend yourself," she said in a low voice. "But we'll talk at home about how to do it in other ways too, okay?" Sophie nodded against her mother's shoulder. "They said you're funny, Mum, in the video." "I know, darling. But you're not. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life." Mary squeezed her eyes shut for a second. Then she stood up. The eviction notice arrived in the form of an envelope leaning against the apartment door that night. 3 months of overdue rent. The landlady had been patient, but patience had an expiry date. Mary had 15 days to pay or vacate. She sat at the kitchen table after Sophie had fallen asleep. She did the math on the back of an envelope. The laundry salary, after deductions, barely covered basic expenses. There was no margin, no savings. There was instead a hole that grew as she tried to plug it. She stared at the numbers for a long time. The second bad news arrived the next day, via cell phone, from a former lab colleague who still kept in touch. The message read, "Mary, did you see what came out today on Science Portal? There's an article about you. It's not good." The article had been published in the early hours. Anonymous source, but with details only someone close to Professor Robert Caldwell could know. It claimed Mary Fontaine had tried, years ago, to appropriate collective research as if it were exclusively hers, that there was a history of difficult behavior, that the story of the wronged scientist was a narrative she herself constructed to gain attention after the viral video. Mary read it twice. She felt her stomach drop. It was Robert's hand, she was sure of it, or someone instructed by him. The article cited no evidence, but the insinuations were skillful enough to plant doubts, and doubts were enough in the world she needed to exist in. She stood with the phone in her hand for a long time. Then she did something she had avoided doing since her salary came in. She opened her contacts, scrolled to the letter R, stopped at the name Ryan Sampson, and looked at it as if the name were a door that, once opened, could no longer be closed. She didn't call. Not yet. But Annabelle's card was still on the laundry counter where it had been left, and Mary knew with the same certainty with which she knew the sun rises in the east that she would pick it up the next day. Not because she had given up on herself, but because she had learned in all those months that surviving with dignity sometimes requires making choices that hurt as long as they are hers, as long as they are on her terms, and she had many terms to present. She found him at the Sampson Group headquarters without warning. Mary Fontaine had woken up at 5 in the morning, taken Sophie to Mrs. C's house with a note explaining she would be back by noon, changed out of her uniform into the only professional outfit she still had stored at the back of her closet, black trousers and a charcoal-colored blouse she had bought for a conference presentation years ago, and taken 2 buses to Canary Wharf. The receptionist on the 20th floor looked at her with the quick assessment of someone trained to distinguish scheduled from unscheduled visits. "Do you have an appointment with Mr. Sampson?" "No," Mary said, "but he will see me." She didn't know this for sure. But she had learned that there was a kind of determination that people recognized even without understanding why, and that this determination often opened doors that conventional etiquette left closed. 10 minutes later, Gus Brennan met her in the waiting room. He seemed genuinely relieved to see her. "Mary, Ryan is available." The meeting room was all glass, with a view of the city. Ryan was standing when she entered, which she interpreted as a deliberate choice, a small attempt at equal footing. There was a jug of water on the table and 2 cups of coffee that were still steaming. "You changed your mind," he said. "I came to negotiate," she corrected. "They are different things." She placed a lined notebook she had bought at the neighborhood stationery store on the table. She had spent the night writing and rewriting what she wanted to say, not because she needed the notebook, but because writing helped her think clearly. The terms were in her head. "I have 5 conditions," she said. "If all are accepted, I will participate in 1 public appearance with you, just 1. After that, we have no further mutual obligations." Ryan sat down. Gus stood in a corner, discreet as usual. "First condition," Mary began. "You settle my rent arrears, which amount to 3 months, and pay the current month. Total value, £4,200 for 200. This is not charity. It is payment for services rendered and will be recorded as such." Ryan nodded. "Second condition. My daughter Sophie changes schools by the end of this week. I need a quality public school with pedagogical assistance close to our neighborhood. You have connections with the city council through your foundations. Use them." A pause. "That's possible," Ryan said. "Third condition. The funding for my research. I don't want the Sampson Group's name on the cover of the article. I want access to an equipped laboratory, a scholarship for myself and a research assistant of my choice, and a 2-year contract with renewal at my sole discretion. Any results belong to science, not to you." Ryan looked at Gus. Gus raised his eyebrows slightly, the equivalent, for him, of an enthusiastic sign of approval. "Fourth condition," Mary continued. Her voice was firm, but there was something in it that cost more than the others. "You complete a 60-hour course on power relations in the corporate environment, available online through the Ethos Institute. I don't want a certificate. I don't want this to be publicized. I want you to do it because you need to understand what you did that night. Not for the camera, for yourself." The silence was different this time. Ryan looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the calculator, not the charm, not the discomfort. It was something that resembled being truly seen, which, for some people, is the most uncomfortable experience of all. "And the fifth, Ita," he said, his voice a little lower. "The fifth," Mary said, "is that this negotiation is a business transaction. It is not forgiveness. It is not friendship. I will not be photographed smiling as if we are long-standing allies. In the public appearance, I will say that Mr. Sampson funded my research, and that's it. No manufactured narrative of personal redemption. The story that is told will be true, or it will not be told by me." Ryan remained silent for a moment that lasted long enough to be respectful, not to be calculated. "I accept all 5 conditions," he said. Mary closed the notebook. "When can I start the research?" "Monday," Gus said, before Ryan could answer, and there was a discreet satisfaction on his partner's face that seemed to have come from afar. The public appearance was scheduled for a press conference at the Institute for Advanced Research headquarters, a Sampson Group partner, 2 weeks later. The communications advisor had prepared a simple text. The Sampson Group would announce the funding of research into anti-cancer compounds developed by researcher Mary Fontaine. Full stop. But Mary had spent the next 2 weeks doing something else, besides organizing her research and monitoring Sophie's adaptation to the new school. She had spent those weeks gathering evidence. It wasn't new. She had started this process 3 years ago, when she realized what Robert Caldwell had done. She had saved emails, drafts, date records, messages. What was new was what she discovered when a former colleague from the University of London, encouraged by the viral video and a private conversation they had, opened her own file, and then another, and then one more. Robert Caldwell hadn't done this only to Mary. There was a pattern. 3 researchers in different years. Each had been silenced with variations of the same letter. Each had saved something, a draft, an email, a dated lab note, unaware that the others had also saved things. Together, the evidence formed a story that could no longer be called a misunderstanding. Mary gathered everything into a single file that she had spent hours organizing at the local public library because it was the only place with an accessible computer and printer she knew. She printed a copy, saved another to her email, sent a third to an address she would only reveal at the right time. On the morning of the press conference, she woke up at 6, prepared Sophie's breakfast, dropped her off at the new school, which the girl already called the school with the garden, and went to get ready. Ryan Sampson arrived at the institute before her. He was with Gus and Annabelle, and there were journalists and cameras and microphones arranged in a conference room with the institute's logo on the wall. It was a reasonably small conference, but the main science and business news desks were represented. When Mary entered, there was immediate recognition from several reporters: the woman from the video, the scientist from the laundry, as some had already begun to call her in online texts. Ryan gave a brief introduction, announced the funding, spoke of commitment to science and to redressing injustices in academia with a sincerity that, Mary had to admit, didn't sound completely rehearsed. The 60-hour course had done something, however small. Then it was Mary's turn to speak. She approached the microphone, looked at the room. There were cameras and there were people behind the cameras, and there were, somewhere in the world outside that room, women who had kept files in drawers, waiting for someone to believe them. "I would like to thank the Sampson Group for funding the resumption of my research," she began, her voice clear. "And I would also like to take this platform to speak about something else." Annabelle, in the front row, became very quiet. "My research was stolen," Mary said, "but not just mine." She paused, let the sentence land. "And today, for the first time, I have enough evidence to say that publicly." The room became so silent that the hum of the recording cameras was audible. What would happen in the next few hours would change many things, and Mary Fontaine, who had learned to survive in a hotel basement, was just beginning. The first reporter to raise her hand after Mary finished speaking was from a science and technology magazine. The second was from a news portal with 10 million monthly accesses. The third was from a corporate coverage outlet that Ryan Sampson's advisors knew all too well for their own comfort. Mary answered all questions with the same precision with which, years before, she had presented her research at conferences. There was no anxiety on her face. There was, instead, something that resembled the relief of someone who has carried a weight for a long time and has finally found the right place to put it down. She explained the pattern. 3 researchers, including her, over 8 years, all under the guidance of Professor Robert Caldwell. Publications signed exclusively by him, letters of discredit discreetly distributed in academia when any of them tried to contest. A mechanism so well-oiled that it worked simply because no one had looked at the separate pieces at the same time. "What is the evidence?" asked the Science magazine reporter. "Emails with date stamps, research drafts with laboratory records, internal communications between the researchers and the professor before the publications, documents showing the evolution of the research and who produced it." She paused. "And a signed statement from the 3 affected researchers, which includes detailed testimonies." "Why only now?" Mary considered the question for a second. "Because until now we were invisible. You don't publish about people no one has seen." There was something electric in the air of the room, the sensation of a story reconfiguring itself in real time, which journalists recognized in their bodies before processing it with their minds. Phones began to vibrate. Advisors in the audience leaned in to whisper in ears. Annabelle, in the front row, typed something on her phone with the intensity of someone putting out a fire. Ryan Sampson remained at the back of the room throughout the press conference. Gus was beside him. At some point, amidst the questions, Gus saw him turn slightly towards the window, as if he needed a moment out of everyone's sight. Gus said nothing. Robert Caldwell's name was on all the news portals before 5 in the afternoon. The university issued a statement saying it was investigating the information with seriousness and commitment to academic integrity, which was the kind of phrase that said very little while the investigative process was set in motion. Robert Caldwell did not respond to any requests for comment. His social media accounts were set to private. The department secretary reported that he was on leave for health treatment. which was an impressively coincidental timing. Mary learned all of this through messages that began to arrive throughout the afternoon. Former colleagues who had remained silent for years sent 1 or 2 sentence texts, short like messages from someone who is still afraid but wants to say something. Researchers she barely knew sent audio messages with slightly trembling voices, saying she had done what they hadn't been able to do alone. She was in the apartment kitchen preparing Sophie's dinner when the phone rang with a number she recognized as being from the Institute for Advanced Research. It was the Institute's academic director, a professor named Deborah Manning, whom Mary had briefly met at the press conference. "Mary, I needed to call before formalizing anything," Deborah said. "I watched your presentation today, and I read your research, the original research which a colleague forwarded to me a few months ago after the video." A pause. "We are opening a department of bioactive compounds. I want to offer you the coordination." Mary stood still with the wooden spoon in her hand. "Coordination," she repeated. "With your own team, equipped laboratory, total autonomy over the research line." Deborah paused deliberately. "You would be the principal investigator, not anyone's assistant." Sophie entered the kitchen at that moment, her backpack still on her back, asking what was for dinner, and Mary covered the phone with her hand for a second, looked at her daughter, and felt something that was impossible to name with a single word. "I accept," Mary said. She spent the rest of the night in productive silence, her mind organizing what needed to be done, which research to resume first, which colleagues to contact, how to structure the department. Sophie slept early, exhausted from a busy day at the new school, and Mary stayed up late with a new notebook open on the table, writing not expense accounts, but research plans. In that silence, there was a different quality from all the previous silences in that apartment. The next day, Mary went to the hotel, not to work, to pick up her belongings and say goodbye to Benita. The laundry room was the same as always, noisy and humid and with that persistent smell of fabric softener. Benita was folding sheets when Mary entered. She looked up, saw the professional outfit instead of the uniform, and understood immediately. "You're off then," Benita said. "I am." Benita nodded slowly. Then she crossed the distance between them and hugged Mary with the firmness of someone who hugs, as if hugging were a skill to be practiced. Mary stayed for a moment in that embrace, feeling the noise of the machines around them as a background sound of something that had been real and important. "You were the best surprise this basement ever had," Benita said. "For you were the best person this basement had," Mary replied. On her way out, she passed Supervisor Claudia Roche in the corridor. There was a moment of mutual discomfort, the geometry of 2 bodies meeting in a space that belonged to a power relationship, and now no longer did in the same way. Claudia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Congratulations." It was little, but it was something. As Mary left through the hotel's side corridor, Ryan Sampson was in his office reading, for the second time, Mary's original article on anti-cancer compounds. He had asked his assistant to find a copy after the press conference, not the article published by Robert Caldwell. The original, with Mary's markings and notes in the margins, which had circulated among the 3 researchers before being appropriated. Ryan read slowly. He wasn't a scientist, but he had studied chemical engineering in college before moving into business, and he understood enough to follow the architecture of the reasoning. What was in that document was sophisticated, more than sophisticated. It was the kind of work that has real implications for real people. He sat in the chair for a long time after finishing. The city outside remained the same noisy and demanding city as always. But there was something different in the office, or perhaps in the person sitting in it. Gus entered without knocking, which was allowed between them. He looked at Ryan, at the document on the table, and sat in the chair beside him without being invited. "You're reading her research," Gus said. "Yes." "And?" Ryan placed the document on the table, looked at the name on the cover, Mary Fontaine. "I almost made a high-level joke out of work that could help thousands of people." He said it without drama, without the tone of performative confession. It was the voice of someone doing an accounting and arriving at a result that is not comforting. Gus didn't say, "I told you so," or "good thing you realized." He just said, "What are you going to do with it?" Ryan remained silent for a moment, "I'll start with the course," he said. "The 60 hours. Pause, then we'll see." And there was, in that simple answer, something Gus recognized as the beginning of a change that would not be quick or easy, but that seemed, for the first time, genuine. The process against Robert Caldwell was formalized by the university 3 weeks later, under pressure from the Academic Ethics Board. The 3 affected researchers were represented by the same lawyer, an intellectual property specialist who had read the article on the portal and contacted them on his own. Robert Caldwell was preventively removed from all functions, including ongoing supervisions. Sophie arrived home from school that afternoon with a drawing folded in her backpack. It was a woman in a white lab coat at a laboratory bench, with hair like Mary's, and a smile that took up half her face. Below, in a child's handwriting, still learning a straight line, "The strongest scientist in the world." Mary folded the drawing and put it in the pocket of the lab coat she hadn't yet worn. There was an award ceremony scheduled for 2 months later, the National Scientific Research Award, Emerging Researcher category. She had received the nomination by email on an ordinary morning, while waiting for her coffee to brew, and had read the email twice before believing it. The journey that had taken her from a research laboratory to a hotel basement and back to a laboratory had lasted 4 years, 2 months and 11 days by her count. It was too much time for the world. It was enough time for her to understand things that one doesn't learn in a doctorate, and there was one last thing to do before the award ceremony, one last conversation, one last truth to be spoken aloud, this time on a stage, into a microphone, to as many people as possible. She was ready. The Revere Convention Center had been inaugurated decades earlier, with the promise of being the place where important ideas would take shape. On that June night, with London experiencing one of its rare autumn evenings that were cool without being cold, the building hosted the 34th edition of the National Scientific Research Award. Mary arrived alone. She had thought of inviting someone. She had thought of Benita, of Mrs. C, of the lawyer representing her and the other researchers in the case against Robert Caldwell. She had thought of Sophie, who insisted on staying awake at home with Mrs. C, watching the ceremony streamed online. In the end, she walked alone down the corridor for nominees, who in a dark green dress she had bought at a thrift store and had altered by a neighborhood seamstress, and which looked more beautiful after the alteration than anything she had seen in that hotel window months ago. The Emerging Researcher category was the 5th of the night. She sat while the other categories were announced, listening to the speeches with genuine attention. Not the polite attention of someone waiting their turn, but the attention of someone who understands that every story of recognition carries within it 10 stories of invisible effort. When her name was announced, the applause was warm and immediate. There were people who had followed the case, who knew the story, who knew what the award represented beyond the statuette. She calmly ascended the stage steps. The statuette was heavier than she had imagined. This surprised her, and she stood for a second looking at it before approaching the microphone. "I haven't prepared any speech," she said, and there was in the hall the comforting laughter of those who believe they are about to hear something worth more than any pre-written text. "But I have some things I need to say, and I ask for permission to say them." She placed the statuette on the microphone stand. She stood without it in her hands, which made the image seem somehow more direct. "2 years ago," she began, "I was in a hotel laundry room." The silence was almost complete. Night shift, basement, industrial machines that make a noise you take a while to stop hearing, even when you're at home. She paused. "I had ended up there because a man thought my work was more valuable than myself, and because the system around him agreed, not with words, but with the silence that is more effective than any word. There were cameras, and there were people behind the cameras, and there was, on Mrs. C's phone in the Brixton apartment, an 8-year-old child who had asked to stay awake. In that laundry room I met a woman named Benita." Her voice softened a little, but not weakened. "She's worked there for 18 years. She folds sheets for guests who will never know her name. She arrives before and leaves after. She makes the hotel work the same way foundations make a building stand, from below without appearing in photos." A pause. "This award is for her too." There is a kind of silence that happens when many people in one place at the same time feel the same thing, and it is not an empty silence, it is a full silence. That was the silence in that moment. This award is for Mrs. C, my 70-year-old neighbor, who takes care of my daughter when I can't be home, and who has never asked me for anything but conversation on a Sunday afternoon. Mary looked at a spot in the middle of the hall. It's for Sophie, my 8-year-old daughter, who learned not to cry in places where people could see, and who I hope, with all my heart, learns to cry again when she wants to. There were people in the audience whom it was difficult to imagine crying, men with titles in their names, directors of institutes, editors of scientific journals, and some of them had eyes shining in a way they themselves were processing with some surprise. I was publicly humiliated, Mary said, without drama, with the objectivity of someone stating a fact, by a man who thought I was entertainment. This episode was filmed, and the video made me stop being invisible, which is a good thing, but it raises a question that I would like everyone present here to take home tonight. She let the question form before asking it. Why do you have to be humiliated in a ballroom to stop being invisible? Why do researchers whose work is stolen need a viral video to be heard? Why does Benita need 18 years of work for someone to say her name into a microphone? The hall was very quiet. I don't have the complete answer, Mary said, but I have the research. And the research, contrary to what Professor Robert Caldwell tried to teach me, does not belong to whoever signs it. It belongs to whoever it can help. She picked up the statuette again, looked at it for a second. Thank you. The applause that followed was not polite. It was the kind of applause people give when they need to do something with what they are feeling. In the days that followed, many things progressed with the gradual logic of things finally heading in the right direction. The case against Robert Caldwell advanced. The university formalized the investigation with an independent committee. The scientific publications where the articles had been published opened internal review processes. None of this would be quick, because academic bureaucracy is slow, as is everything involving many egos and little urgency, but it was in motion. The Institute for Advanced Research Laboratory was inaugurated with a simple plaque on the door, Department of Bioactive Compounds. Mary Fontaine, principal investigator. She hired a research assistant who had been Robert's student and had left the group 2 years prior without ever saying why. They didn't talk about it on the first day, but there was a mutual understanding in the room that rendered explanations unnecessary. Ryan Sampson completed the 60-hour course. He told no one, as he had promised. But Gus noticed small changes in meetings, the way he listened more before speaking, how he had started asking questions about the frontline employees of the group's companies, how he had proposed a salary adjustment for service roles that was higher than what the HR department had requested. It wasn't a cinematic transformation. It was something more akin to a consciousness that had been awakened, and that he was still learning to use. It was perhaps the most honest version of a change. He lost 2 old investors who considered the new compliance and labor ethics policies excessively restrictive for business growth. He gained 3 others, smaller but more aligned, including a social impact fund that had followed the case since the video. Gus told him one afternoon as they were closing the quarter's numbers that he thought the company was heading in a good direction. Ryan said he thought it would take more time to know. It was the most honest answer Gus had heard from him in years. 3 months after the award ceremony, the Grand Imperial Hotel implemented a formal employee protection protocol, including anonymous reporting channels and policies against punitive transfers. Supervisor Claudia Roche had asked to be included in the committee that developed the new rules. It wasn't exactly penance, but it was participation. Benita Sanders was promoted to laundry shift coordinator. She celebrated with coffee and a homemade cake she made at home and brought to share with the team. When Mary visited the hotel, Benita was teaching a new colleague how to handle the machines with the same patience of someone who had spent 18 years making the invisible work. They have their own personalities, Benita told her colleague, pointing to the larger machine. She saw Mary and smiled with her whole face. It took a while. It did, Mary agreed. They drank coffee in the back corridor, sitting on overturned plastic crates, with the noise of the machines as a soundtrack. They talked for 40 minutes about their lives, about Sophie and the new school, about Benita's niece who had passed her nursing entrance exam, about the cold weather that had arrived earlier than expected that year. When Mary left, Benita stood at the corridor entrance for a moment, watching the elevator close. Then she went back inside. There were still many clothes to fold. That night, Mary arrived at the apartment to find Sophie at the table with an open notebook, writing something with the seriousness of someone doing important work. She approached from behind and read over her daughter's shoulder. It was a list. At the top, in careful handwriting, things I want to be when I grow up. The first item, a scientist. The second, brave. The third, in slightly different handwriting, as if it had been added after careful thought, the person who speaks for the invisible. Mary read the 3 items, looked at her daughter who hadn't noticed her presence. She stood there in the silence of that small apartment that had survived things greater than its size suggested. She didn't wake Sophie. She didn't say anything. She just gently folded the notebook page to the next blank one and left a pen beside it for what came next. End of story. If Mary's journey touched your heart, know that she is made of the same fibers that compose every person who has ever been invisible and found the strength to make themselves seen. We have many more stories like this to tell. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any chapters. Leave a like if this story deserved to be told. And tell us in the comments which character stayed with you the most. Benita, Sophie, or the Mary from the basement who didn't forget who she was. Your answer keeps this story going.